a conflict that spanned nearly half a century, a war of ideology, influence, and survival without ever becoming a direct battlefield clash between the world's two superpowers. From the ruins of World War II emerged visions for the future. The democratic capitalism of the United States and the communist socialism of the Soviet Union. For 46 years, the world lived in the shadow of nuclear destruction, as East and West fought for power through proxy wars, espionage, propaganda, and competition. This is the story of the Cold War from start to finish. The world after World War II. In 1945, the Second World War ended, but peace was far from secure. Europe lay in ruins. Cities from Warsaw to Berlin were rubble. Millions were dead or displaced. Two nations emerged from the ashes as global superpowers: the United States, with its industrial strength and nuclear monopoly, and the Soviet Union, with its vast army and territorial reach. Though allies in war, they were rivals in peace. Their visions for the future could not have been more different. The United States promoted democracy, open markets, and capitalism. The Soviet Union championed communism, centralized power, and a one-party state. The seeds of the Cold War were sown in the ashes of victory. Yalta and Potsdam conferences. At Yalta in February 1945, the Allied leaders Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin met to decide the fate of post-war Europe. Stalin demanded a buffer zone in Eastern Europe, citing past invasions from the West. Roosevelt and Churchill agreed to Soviet influence in Poland and other areas, but insisted on free elections. Stalin gave his word, but secretly planned otherwise. At Potsdam in July, the dynamic had shifted. Roosevelt was dead. Churchill had been voted out. Harry Truman, the new US president, took a tougher stance. He knew the United States had the atomic bomb, and used this knowledge to pressure Stalin. Instead of building trust, these conferences deepened suspicion. Europe's future would not be decided by friendship, but by power. The Iron Curtain descends. In 1946, Winston Churchill gave a famous speech. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that curtain lay Eastern Europe, under Soviet control. Stalin installed communist governments in Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and others. Political opponents were silenced, elections manipulated, dissent crushed. The West saw this as betrayal of Yalta's promises. To the Soviets, it was security. To millions of ordinary people, it was the start of 4 decades of division. The Truman Doctrine and Marshall Plan. In 1947, the United States announced the Truman Doctrine. Its message was clear. America would support any nation threatened by communism. Greece and Turkey received immediate aid, preventing them from falling under Soviet influence. That same year, Secretary of State George Marshall proposed a massive economic aid program to rebuild Europe. The Marshall Plan pumped billions of dollars into Western Europe, reviving economies and binding nations closer to the US. The Soviets rejected the plan, forbidding Eastern Bloc countries from participating. Europe was now divided not only by ideology, but by prosperity. Berlin blockade and airlift. Berlin became the first flashpoint of the Cold War. In 1948, Stalin tried to force the Western Allies out of Berlin by cutting off road, rail, and canal access to the city. 2 million people were trapped without food or fuel. The US and Britain responded with the Berlin airlift. For nearly a year, planes flew around the clock, delivering supplies. At the height of the operation, one plane landed every 30 seconds. In 1949, Stalin lifted the blockade, defeated without a single shot fired. But the message was clear: Berlin would remain the most dangerous fault line of the Cold War. Formation of NATO. In April 1949, Western nations formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. Its promise: an attack on one would be treated as an attack on all. The Soviet Union saw this as a hostile military alliance. A few years later, they responded with their own pact, the Warsaw Pact. Europe was now officially divided into 2 armed camps. The Cold War had hardened. The Soviet atomic bomb. The US believed its atomic bomb gave it an unchallengeable edge. That changed in August 1949, when the Soviet Union tested its first nuclear weapon. The arms race had begun. Both sides poured resources into building bigger, deadlier weapons. Soon came the hydrogen bomb, thousands of times more powerful than Hiroshima. The balance of terror defined the era, each side capable of destroying the other, and perhaps the world. Communist victory in China. In 1949, another shock: Mao Zedong's communist forces triumphed in the Chinese Civil War. The world's most populous nation joined the communist camp. The balance of power shifted dramatically. To the West, it seemed communism was spreading uncontrollably. To the Soviets, it was a major victory, though relations with Mao would later sour. The Korean War. In 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea with Soviet and Chinese support. The US, under the United Nations, rushed to defend the South. The war raged across the peninsula. At one point, UN forces pushed the North to the Chinese border. China intervened, sending massive armies. The front stabilized near the 38th parallel. After 3 brutal years and millions of deaths, the war ended in stalemate. Korea remains divided to this day, a reminder that Cold War conflicts left scars that never healed. The death of Stalin and a thaw. March 1953, Joseph Stalin was dead. His iron grip on the Soviet Union had defined the early Cold War. His paranoia and brutality left millions dead and Eastern Europe firmly in Moscow's orbit. After his death, a power struggle ensued. Eventually, Nikita Khrushchev rose to the top. Unlike Stalin, Khrushchev promised reform and a thaw in relations with the West. In 1956, he delivered a secret speech denouncing Stalin's cult of personality. The speech shocked the communist world and gave hope that change was possible. But Khrushchev was unpredictable. At times he sought peaceful coexistence. At others he brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. The Cold War entered a new volatile phase, the Hungarian Uprising. In 1956, Hungarians rose up against Soviet domination. Students, workers, and even soldiers took to the streets of Budapest, demanding freedom, democracy, and withdrawal from the Warsaw Pact. For a moment, it seemed possible. A reformist government took power and announced Hungary would leave the Soviet sphere. Moscow's response was brutal. Thousands of Soviet tanks rolled into Hungary, crushing the uprising in blood. Nearly 3,000 Hungarians were killed, and 200,000 fled into exile. The message was clear. The Soviet Union would tolerate no rebellion in its empire. And the West, despite its words of support, would not intervene directly. The space race begins. In October 1957, the world looked up in awe and fear. The Soviet Union had launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. For Americans, this was a wake-up call. The Soviets had not only beaten them into space, but proved they could launch intercontinental missiles. The space race was born. Billions were poured into science, technology, and education. The US created NASA. Both superpowers sought not only to explore space, but to prove their ideological superiority. This race would lead to one of humanity's greatest achievements, and also serve as a propaganda battlefield in the Cold War, the Berlin Crisis and the war. Berlin remained the epicenter of Cold War tension. By 1961, East Germany was hemorrhaging citizens. Millions had fled through Berlin to the west. To stop this, the Soviets and East Germans built a wall. Overnight, barbed wire cut the city in two. Families were separated, workers unable to cross. Escape attempts often ended in death. The Berlin Wall became the most powerful symbol of the Cold War, a prison wall dividing freedom and oppression. When US tanks faced Soviet tanks at Checkpoint Charlie in 1961, the world once again feared war. But both sides pulled back. The wall remained, a scar through the heart of Europe. The Cuban Missile Crisis. October 1962. The world came closer to nuclear war than ever before. The Soviet Union, under Khrushchev, secretly placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida. When US spy planes discovered them, President John F. Kennedy demanded their removal. For 13 days, the world held its breath. American ships blockaded Cuba. Soviet ships steamed toward them. Nuclear bombers were on alert. One miscalculation could mean global destruction. At the last moment, a deal was struck. The Soviets would withdraw their missiles, and the US secretly agreed to remove its missiles from Turkey. The crisis showed the terrifying danger of the Cold War and the need for restraint. Vietnam, America's quagmire. In the 1960s, the Cold War's fiercest battles were fought not in Europe but in Asia. The United States, determined to stop the spread of communism, became embroiled in Vietnam. What began as military advisors soon escalated into a full-scale war. American forces faced guerrilla fighters who knew the jungles, while back home, public support crumbled. Protests swept the nation. Television brought the horrors of war into living rooms nightly. By 1973, the US withdrew, and in 1975, Saigon fell to communist forces. Vietnam exposed the limits of American power. and left scars that would last generations. The Prague Spring. In 1968, hope bloomed in Czechoslovakia. Under leader Alexander Dubček, reforms promised socialism with a human face, freedom of speech, press, and political opposition. For a few months, Prague was alive with optimism, but Moscow feared this example could spread. In August, Warsaw-packed troops invaded, crushing the Prague Spring. Once again, the message was unmistakable. No deviation from Soviet orthodoxy would be tolerated. A period of calm. By the 1970s, both sides were weary. The Vietnam War had drained America. The Soviet economy was stagnant. The constant nuclear threat loomed over all. Thus began a relaxation of tensions. U.S. President Richard Nixon visited Moscow, the first sitting president to do so. Agreements limited nuclear weapons. Trade increased. Dialogue replaced constant threats. For a while, it seemed the Cold War might end peacefully, but was fragile, dependent on trust neither side fully had. The Soviet war in Afghanistan. Inigo collapsed. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to prop up a friendly communist regime. The war quickly turned into a disaster. Afghan fighters, known as the Mujahideen, resisted fiercely. The US supplied them with weapons, including the famous Stinger missiles. The Soviet Union bled resources, soldiers, and morale. The Soviet Vietnam would drag on for nearly a decade, and play a major role in the USSR's eventual downfall. Reagan and the Second Cold War. In the 1980s, Cold War tensions returned with force. US President Ronald Reagan called the Soviet Union an evil empire, and launched a massive military buildup. His proposed Strategic Defense Initiative, nicknamed Star Wars, aimed to build space-based missile defenses. Though technologically unproven, it terrified Moscow, which feared falling behind in a new arms race. Reagan's hardline stance escalated tensions, but also, ironically, set the stage for negotiation with a new kind of Soviet leader, the rise of Gorbachev. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became leader of the Soviet Union. Young and energetic and pragmatic, he realized the Soviet system was collapsing under its own weight. He introduced glasnost, openness, and perestroika restructuring. For the first time, criticism of the government was tolerated. Economic reforms sought to revive the failing economy. But Gorbachev's reforms unleashed forces he could not control. Across Eastern Europe, people began to demand freedom. Solidarity in Poland. In Poland, workers' strikes led by Lech Wałęsa and the Solidarity movement challenged communist rule. Though initially suppressed, the movement endured. By the late 1980s, Solidarity became a symbol of resistance across the Eastern Bloc. Gorbachev, unlike his predecessors, refused to use force to crush it. The dam was breaking. The fall of the Berlin Wall. November 9, 1989. A day that changed history. After weeks of protests, East German authorities made a mistake in announcing travel freedoms. Crowds surged to the Berlin Wall, demanding passage. Confused border guards opened the gates. Tens of thousands poured through. People climbed the wall, tore it apart with hammers, embraced strangers from the other side. The Berlin Wall, the ultimate symbol of Cold War division, had fallen. Revolutions in Eastern Europe. One by one, communist regimes collapsed. In Czechoslovakia, the Velvet Revolution peacefully ended decades of communist rule. In Romania, dictator Nicolae Ceausescu was overthrown and executed. From Hungary to Bulgaria, the dominoes fell. The Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe crumbled without a shot from Moscow. The dissolution of the Soviet Union. By 1991, the Soviet Union itself was unraveling. Economic collapse, nationalist movements, and political instability tore it apart. In August, hardline communists attempted a coup against Gorbachev. It failed, but fatally weakened his authority. By December, the Soviet Union formally dissolved into 15 independent states. The red flag over the Kremlin was lowered for the last time. The Cold War was over. Legacy of the Cold War. The Cold War lasted nearly half a century. It shaped borders, alliances, economies, and cultures. It left behind nuclear arsenals that still threaten the world, scars in nations divided, and lessons about ideology, power, and restraint. Though the United States emerged as the sole superpower, the Cold War's legacy lives on, in conflicts, rivalries, and the lingering shadow of nuclear weapons. The Cold War was not a single conflict, but a global struggle fought in politics, technology, proxy wars, and ideology. It began in the ruins of World War II and ended with the fall of the Soviet Union. For decades, humanity lived on the knife's edge of nuclear destruction, yet somehow avoided it. It was an age of fear, but also of progress, an age of division, but also of resilience. Thank you for watching the Cold War under 30 minutes. If you enjoyed this documentary, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share to support the channel. Which part of the Cold War do you find most fascinating? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Until next time, stay curious, and keep exploring history.